Hello class, today we're here talking about chapter 4, which is related to fundamental research issues. So let's go ahead and get started. This chapter has quite a bit of really important information. So while I'm going to only go over a small bit with you today, I highly encourage you to take a look at the entire chapter and make sure that you're really pairing your understanding with your LearnSmart. And of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. We can schedule some time during office hours, and I'm happy to connect with you and answer any questions you may have. So one of the really big and important issues of this chapter is the information regarding an operational definition. Operational definitions are very important, and I'll go over that in just a second. But make sure when you're looking through this chapter that you do have a very good understanding of what an operational definition is, but also how you would create one in your own research. Right? So what would you need to know in order to have a really good operational definition? Your book also goes into different relationships, so positive, negative, curvilinear, or no relationship. There's also a discussion about the difference between non-experimental and experimental research methods. We'll briefly go into the difference between an independent and a dependent variable. This is something that will continue to remain with you even as you move into statistics and then as you move into capstone as well. So again, here, make sure you have a really great understanding of an independent variable and a dependent variable and how they relate to one another within your research or within research in general. Your book also talks about some of the limitations of a strictly laboratory-only design and some of the advantages of using multiple methods of research. And then finally, your chapter ends by talking about the difference between construct validity, internal validity, and external validity. So what's a variable? A variable is any event, situation, behavior, or individual characteristic that varies. Very convenient, right? So I hope that when you read that, you're like, all right, but what does that mean? Well, things like age, gender, stress, anger, reaction time, perceived distance, all of these things could be variables. And in order to be a variable, it must have at least two values, right? So we should be able to look at them in at least two different perspectives. Now, some variables are really easy to define and to measure. So things like the effect of exercise on blood pressure. This is pretty self-explanatory, right? So we can have people do exercise, we can vary the amount of exercise they do, and then we can literally take their blood pressure, right? And we can do this with a blood pressure monitor. But sometimes in psychology, we're often interested in abstract things. So for example, what is hunger? Well, I could probably ask you what hunger is, and I imagine that you would all probably give me varying definitions. So in a research study, what would be a good way of measuring hunger? Could I simply just ask a participant, are you hungry? Well, I could, but people look at hunger in a little bit different ways, right? So you might be hungry right now just simply because I asked you about hunger. Some people view they are hungry if their stomach starts to make a noise, or if they feel a pang, or if it gets close to dinner time or lunchtime or whatnot. So simply asking somebody if they're hungry might not be a good way to measure hunger, right? And this is really important when we start to think about concepts that are abstract. So think about things like memory or happiness or depression or sociability. How do we measure this? So in order to do this, we have to turn that behavior into something that we can directly measure. So happiness. How do we measure if somebody is happy? There are lots of different ways, right, for us to measure whether somebody's happy. I can ask a person if they're happy, but again, your response to that is going to vary greatly based on your understanding of happiness. So this is when we get into an operational definition, and this is the specific way that we are going to measure that construct. So here we have to be extremely explicit. I have these images over here of a cat and a baby smiling, and we may agree that when you're happy, you smile, right? So my operational definition might be something like the number of times a person smiles in 10 minutes. But we also need to know a system for smiling. I mean, is this a smile? Is this a smile? Right? Everybody's a little bit different in what they're going to come back and say a smile is. So we also need to have a system to evaluate that. So you're getting into the nitty-gritty. Now, the one thing about psychology is that we are very often interested in quantifying behavior. But behavior is also really hard to quantify. Something as overtly simple as happiness, right? Are you happy? That seems really easy. But when you start trying to get into quantifying happiness, you'll start to realize that it's actually pretty difficult. So I want you to think about this. How would you operationally define aggression? And feel free to email me, your thoughts on this. If you happen to join us in class, we'll talk about this then as well. But aggression, again, seems to be pretty simple. Is a person who hits another person aggressive? Is a person who spreads rumors about somebody aggressive? The answer, the truth is, both people would be considered aggressive, but that may not be the way in which you want to quantify aggression. So kind of think about maybe a definition, an operational definition that you might use here. Okay, so we can also take a look at experimental versus non-experimental methods of research. An experiment is going to be a research study involving a direct manipulation and control of variables. So for example, in 2005, Bushman did a study where he had participants watch a TV show that contained violence. So a show like Cops, or sex, like Sex in the City, or something that was nonviolent and didn't have any sex in it, like America's Funniest Animals. So what they did in this experiment is they varied which show that you watched, and then in between, every person in the experiment saw the exact same commercials. And then afterwards, each participant was given a memory test about the brands that appeared in the commercials. And what they wanted to see is, does the type of television that you watch, if it is full of violence or sex, does that cause you to have impairments in your memory? Are you less likely to remember certain brands that you were exposed to? And unsurprisingly, that's exactly what they found. They found that sex and violence did affect memory for brands, and that people who were watching the neutral categories or things that didn't have violence or sex, that America's Funniest Animals, actually recalled more of the brands from the commercials as compared to our other two categories. We would consider this to be an experiment because people are being assigned to different conditions. Now we'll talk about random assignment, but random assignment is really important here. So each person has an equal opportunity of being placed into any of these categories. We would not allow a participant to choose what category they wanted to be a part of. A non-experimental method is looking at a relationship that exists already. So looking at potentially two variables and seeing if they might be related. You can have non-experimental methods in lots of different types of research, and we're going to talk about many of these types of research during the remainder of this semester. So observational research, survey research, correlational research can all use non-experimental methods. Here we want to take a look at a behavior that's occurring naturally. So we're not actually manipulating anything. For example, Geller, Russ, and Altamari wanted to take a look at college students' drinking behavior, and they wanted to see if it varied based on being at a party or a bar. They didn't randomly assign individuals to condition. They didn't manipulate what condition they were in. They simply went to these parties or bars and just observed naturally how college students drank. Another study looked at asked students questions about their work and hours and saw how that influenced their GPA. So again, they simply wanted to see if the number of hours maybe you worked was related to your college GPA. They didn't randomly assign anyone here. They didn't manipulate the independent variable. They were just looking at how two variables related to one another. They were just generally looking at behavior that occurred naturally. It's important to remember that correlation does not imply causation. So if something is correlated